These are people who grew up without paid TV, and so it does become a little bit more easy to picture that these demographics won't have a need or a desire to have any sort of paid TV, and they'll kind of use these subscription platforms, and that'll provide them all the content they can hope for.
Hey gang, it's Monday, June 7th. Monica, Shelleen, Cindy, Oscar, and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm Marcus, and today I'm joined by a bunch of forecasting analysts. We have with us our head of forecasting. Her name is Monica Peart.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, Monica. She heads up the team. We're also joined by our Senior Director of Forecasting, Shelleen Shum.
Hey, everyone.
Hey there, Shelleen. We're also joined by our two Directors of Forecasting. We have Cindy Liu.
Hi.
Hey, Cindy. And we also have Oscar Orozco.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, chap. So, today's fact. In the year zero, there were about 200 million people on the planet. This is crazy. Nigeria, which is the 7th largest country in the world, has about 200 million-ish people. So it'd be like the population of Nigeria spread out across the entire planet. That's how many people there were. By 1700, it was 600 million people. So in 1,700 years, population grew by 400 million, from 200 to 600 million in 1,700 years. In the last 10 years, population has grown by nearly 1 billion. So in the 1900 and 1900, there were 1.5 billion people in the world. So 120 years ago, there were 1.5 billion people. We're now closer to 8 billion people, which is just insane.
Wow.
I remember when it was 6 billion. That
Yeah.
seems like that big number, and then now it's already, we're talking about 8 billion. Crazy.
Such an old man, Oscar.
I
remember when there was. Same indeed. Today's real topic, what the media world will look like in 2030, part 2. So, what will the world look like in 2030? 1 in every 2 people will live in APAC. 1 in every 2 people on the planet will live in Asia Pacific, says Euromonitor. The number of US workers in full-time permanent employment, will drop to 9% of the workforce. Just 9% of people in full-time permanent employment, says PwC. And the oldest millennial will be 50 years old in 2030, notes global commerce real estate services company Cushman and Wakefield. But what will the world of media look like in 2030? Well, we have forecasters here to help us out. These 4 Avengers only come together twice a year for this show. So they're going to have them we've had them for part 1 and now for part 2. And then maybe in 6 months' time, we'll get them together again to try and predict what the world's going to look like in 2030. Monica, you already explained in part 1 how we went about this exercise, how you guys went about this exercise. Typically, the forecasting team looks at billions of pieces of data, it seems, thousands and thousands of numbers from thousands and thousands of sources, and figures out what their methodology is, what they're talking about with their numbers, with their different surveys, and puts out all that data in a model and tries to figure out what's really going on, what's the real number going to be. But for this, what you guys did, I didn't really do anything. You guys have forecasts out to 2025 already. I asked you to push it a little bit further. You said no first, and then I kept asking, and eventually you guys said, fine, as long as you leave us alone after that. And so you guys stretched those forecasts out to 2030. Does that sound about right, Monica? Is that what happened?
That's right. We have many existing forecasts that we're able to take a look at the metrics that are driving them in the near term and use that to understand, okay, past the forecast end where we published, in 2025, looking anywhere past that, what if we extrapolate those trends? What if we push those trends further? What would that look like in 2030? So yes, that's exactly correct.
Perfect. So in part 1, we talked about a bunch of things. Some of those things were, what share of digital advertising will the big 3 have in 2030? Google, Facebook, and Amazon. How much shopping will be done online in 2030? And will people still be listening to the radio in 2030? Or will that be a thing of the past? Kind of like the Walkman. I miss my Walkman. I don't miss the Walkman. It was terrible. The CD, you got to hold it flat the whole time.
That was
So
the
impractical.
Discman, and I miss my Discman.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
the
that's-
disc.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, the cassette was
Yeah,
way
that
more
was
durable.
you're past the cassette.
Okay, sorry.
I miss that thing. Come on, it's great. It's great.
So let's talk a couple of predictions for 2030. The first one, Monica, is one you looked at. You were looking at pay TV households. First of all, explain what pay TV means for us, and then explain to us how many people will be paying for TV by our definition in 10 years.
Right. So pay TV was an interesting one. I think we have all interacted or not interacted with it on purpose in the past year. So we're all very well aware of what this arena involves. But just to go back to a definition, because there can be some confusion, a pay TV household is really just a household with a subscription to a traditional service like cable, satellite, telco, or fiber providers for TV access, for TV services. And although we pay for other services like, maybe Netflix or Hulu or even, Sling, those are not considered pay TV because they are not the traditional access points, the ones that cable or satellite company would provide to a household. Those are all pure play online, and so we count them in a different category. But just to be clear, this is for the traditional side of TV access. And so when we think about pay TV in the traditional sense, it has been on the decline, an even more rapid decline in recent years because of the availability of online or pure play types of video. And a lot of those same companies, those traditional networks and cable providers are now working with a lot of the pure play players to provide that content. So that has made a more precipitous decline in where we are with pay TV traditional services today. Between now and 2030, we are moving from 74 million households having pay TV access to only 48 million households having pay TV access, which is a decline of 26 million households. The driving force of this is really attrition from cable. Cable providers have absolutely been increasing prices, or whatever price increases they are absorbing, they are passing on to customers. And so customers are responding to that by either switching to smaller bundles or switching out of cable altogether and going for digital properties like the Sling TV or those that can provide a very similar TV experience. But really the movement in cable has been the biggest piece of this decline. In fact, cable decline of households represents 62% of the overall decline. And just to be clear, there are cable providers, satellite providers, telco providers, and cable is making up a majority of that. So that's where we are sitting today.
So you said you're talking to millions. In terms of households, is 58% have pay TV today, and that's falling to...
That's falling to 35% of households by 2030.
35%. Wow. Okay. And you were saying the driving factor, if you had to, it's a combination of things, but if you had to rank them, is it price driving them away? Is it other services like those kind of skinny bundles, linear TV bundles, like YouTube TV, Sling TV, pulling people over to them? Is it people moving over because of, saying goodbye to sports on one platform, moving to the other? What's the ranking there?
Right. So the biggest reason is going to be price and availability of the content that you want. Those are almost inextricably linked. One can understand something as being expensive if it doesn't have the content that you're looking for. So paying higher prices for cable has generally meant that we're now looking at, what other avenues have the content that people are most interested in? And they're finding it in other places versus, maybe a decade ago, that was not the case. There weren't a lot of other places, even though your cable subscription was quite highly priced, there weren't a lot of other places where that content could be found. And so this idea that it has become relatively more expensive is true, and also that the content is available elsewhere. So those are kind of the two. It's almost hard to separate the impact of those two. They're kind of together, but there are other smaller factors behind them. I mean, one you just alluded to, which is the reality around sports. A lot of cable and live TV viewership is in the arena of sports. It's one of those last bastions of live TV. The need for it to be live is certainly there. But as we all probably know and are aware, some of those licensing deals are moving to streaming platforms, so making it again available elsewhere. But also last year was quite a pandemic-fueled reality of dropping because the sports content was not anywhere. And so a lot of people who have their cable subscription because of sports viewership did not see the need for it while things were being postponed or maybe seasons were being canceled throughout the year. So that was also another driving factor. But when we think about the forecast, some of those things won't continue to be impacted. So we think about that as a temporary reality, but the reality around price and availability of content is here to stay.
So when I think about 35% of, so basically going from just under 2/3 to about a third of people, 58% to 35% of people having pay TV in 2030. That seems like a lot of people actually, holding out, 9 years time, still having pay TV. However, you think about the contracts and the media rights deals, and the NFL just signed a huge one, which extends a lot of the contracts through with the networks through to about 2030. Some of these other networks as well still have contracts or are renewing contracts, which will likely extend that far as well. And so sports will still be on live TV by and large, as well as other places. But if people can still get it there, why move around? So I could see that, that remaining 35% being very sports focused, older demographic, news focused demographic. That said, the idea of sports content moving from one platform to the other, live TV over to streaming platforms, some sports viewership is just disappearing, or it just never happening in the first place, because younger people consume sports differently. They consume highlights, they consume tweets, they follow players instead. So some of that viewership just is evaporating. It's not moving from one platform to the other. It's going from watching a full game on TV to just consuming the highlights or the box scores a bit later on. What do the rest of you think about this prediction? 2030, 35% of people with cable.
That 35% number is jarring, as you said. It's almost hard to imagine. But we've discussed all the content stuff, and I agree with all that. But I was thinking, even looking more in the future, when you consider households that will be run by, as you said even earlier, a millennial that'll be 50 years old, Gen Zers, as they start having their own households. These are people who grew up without pay TV. And so it does become a little bit more easy to picture that these demographics won't have a need or a desire to have any sort of pay TV, and they'll kind of use these subscription platforms, and that'll provide them all the content they can hope for.
Yeah, I think Gen Z is also going to be at least close to, if not the biggest or largest generation as well. So yeah, definitely one to watch. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just kind of thinking about, my own experience when I cut the cord. I think like a few years ago, finally being able to cut the cord, and then I subscribed to Hulu. It was like, honestly, I'm going to use the word. It was like a liberating experience, not being under a contract, not being obligated, to be like locked into this annual contract. I think with Hulu, it's just this freeing experience because you can stop and start whenever you want. And I think a lot of consumers are used to that now and are just that type of behavior just becoming more accustomed. Yeah.
We'll now have to wait at home for someone to come round between, June 11th and August to clamber on top of my roof. Just so I can watch the Lakers get annihilated. That leads us quite nicely onto the next prediction. So digital video, Cindy, you were looking at digital video for us, and also who the top 3 digital video players were likely to be in 2030.
Yeah, so in 2030, we have 70% of the population will be streaming video through any number of subscription services. And that's up from 62% in 2020. And the leader in the space will still be Netflix. So Netflix will lead with 58% of the US population. And then that's followed by Amazon Prime and then Disney Plus. And, those rankings actually don't change throughout the forecast. It's just the gap between them does narrow. So Amazon will have about 51% of the population will be watching Amazon Prime. And then with Disney, actually, that grows the fastest. So with Disney Plus, we have about 50% of the population watching.
Right. So two things I want to touch on. First of all, 62% of the US population currently stream video through a paid service. That's going to 70% in 2030. Are you surprised it's only going up 8 points, so basically 1 point each year?
Yeah, I extended the forecast out. We do have, growth flattening a bit through the end of the forecast.
Okay.
And, it will reach a level of like a ceiling, I think. I think
right.
with we still have, 35% of households still subscribing to pay TV service.
Right. Drives quite well with that.
Right. And, I did, what was interesting here was I did look back at when we were looking at pay TV just to see how fast the declines were. And I think going back to if we look about 10 years ago, for example, about 82% of households subscribed to pay TV service. So that was just, in 2010. And Netflix hadn't really, Netflix was almost this DVD rental service provider. They didn't really have their streaming service didn't come on board until 2013. And once we hit 2013, that's when the pay TV started declining more precipitously.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So House of Cards was really the first, Netflix's original programming. It hit the market. It was really popular and mainstream. And then Netflix really started growing their streaming service, starting in 2013. And that's kind of when you see this decline in pay TV service.
Right. So those top three, Netflix 58%, Prime Video 51%, Disney Plus 50%. They're our top three in 2030. They're the percentages of the population using those services. What's interesting though, Cindy, is Disney Plus, we don't have it as the number 3 today at all.
No, we don't. So,
right.
We have, I think Hulu is in third place. Disney Plus, will, outstrip Hulu starting in 2023. The growth in Disney Plus is really just a clear indication of how much the company is spending on the platform in terms of content. So, I think in one of their recent investor events, they already announced that, they're planning to spend, I think, 8 to 9 billion on Disney Plus content in fiscal 2024. And that's over, I think, 60% of what they're spending across all their platforms. Mind you, they do also own Hulu and ESPN.
Right.
Yeah.
So any thoughts from anyone else on these numbers? There's so much can happen in that space of time. Will one of these streaming platforms buy a movie chain? There's talk of Netflix getting into video games. Eric Hagstrom on the forecasting team was saying he thinks that's more so they can buy the rights to some of those characters, to some of those titles, so they can create movies about those video game characters and storylines, as opposed to them really caring loads about gaming. Any thoughts on digital video in 2030?
Yeah, I was going to add that, the switch there with Disney is interesting because we don't always think about, we think about the behemoths in the space and they have always been a behemoth in the TV space. But that actually speaks to something really clear, which is the content that they're bringing. And we all, and Cindy mentioned it already, but the idea that in those early years, Netflix was spending billions each year on beefing up their content, just the content, the original content, but also, buying license to other network content. That's something that Disney does not have to do. They already own a lot of these rights and already are, have the distribution deals around a lot of the content, and will also add the original content too. So when I think about how huge they are, Disney already, they're a latecomer that can almost be a latecomer. And I think that makes a lot of sense because they already have so much dominance in the TV space.
Yeah, and I would just add, these services, there's a lot of talk always about how much they're spending on content, billions and billions of dollars, not making a profit. As of now, it's only Netflix, correct, as of very recently. But I think they will have to continue investing in content to compete. I think some of them being a part of these larger media conglomerates can afford to do that. It'll be interesting, to see if there's any consolidation in the future. But I think that would come below these three. And so I totally fully agree that these are the three that I would see 9 years from now, continuing to reign at the top of the market.
Yeah. And just quickly, talking about the spending. So Netflix and the rankings actually align pretty well with how much these services are spending. So Netflix, I think in fiscal 2021, say they'll spend over $17 billion on video content alone. So,
wow.
That's an enormous. Amazon
Double.
Prime
that's double.
spent $11 billion last year on video and music. And then Disney Plus, again, like I said earlier, was $8 to $9 billion in 2024. So the rankings kind of align with how much these services are planning to spend on content.
Yeah. Good indicator of how much you spend can translate into how high up the rankings you are. I'm going to be speaking to Eric Hagstrom later in the week about the media universe. And Oscar, you mentioned consolidation. We've had a few deals as of late. I'm going to be talking more about other things that they see coming and what they make of some of the recent moves in the media universe. Oscar, let's move to our third prediction here. You were looking at social network users, and you also had a look at the top three for us and what social network usage will look like in 2030.
Yeah, great. I mean, similar to what we just talked about with the subscription video platforms, currently, when we rank them 1, 2, and 3, it's Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. But what I'm projecting is that by 2030, TikTok will jump to third, and Facebook and Instagram will remain at sort of number 1 and number 2.
Right. And TikTok does that quite quickly in the grand scheme of 10 years.
They do. So they move in front of Snapchat in 2023. I will say, just a quick comment on Snapchat. We're still very bullish on Snapchat, but what's going on is TikTok is more of this viral type of social platform that's more adept to broadcasting, and Snapchat is a bit more one-on-one interactions, more private networks, and so that can limit it when you do look at scale in the in the long term. But yes, TikTok as of 2023, we're projecting will move in front of Snapchat, and that gap with Snapchat will continue to get larger into the forecast years.
Mm-hmm. So that was the ranking. You said Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. What percentages can you give us in terms of usage amongst those different services by 2030?
By 2030. So to better kind of understand what the numbers are, currently about 180 Americans are on Facebook. So that number won't grow too quickly, but it will grow to 192 million by 2030. So currently it's about 54% of the population, and that's more or less where it'll sit. So again, it'll kind of grow with population growth, with internet growth. So it's pretty flat, but it'll remain at number 1 because that's a huge number. Mm-hmm. Then when looking at the second platform, which is Instagram, right now about 35% of the population is on Instagram. By 2030, it'll reach over 41%. So it's up to 4 in 10 people in the US that'll be on Instagram. So some strong growth there from 119 million to 146. So about 27 million more users. So strong growth, stronger than what we're projecting for Facebook. And then with TikTok, currently it's about 23% of the population that's at TikTok. What we're projecting is by 2030, it'll reach to 3 in 10 of the US consumers will be on TikTok. So 30% of the population. So definitely below, the 50 plus from Facebook, 40 plus from Instagram, but it's a great threshold that it'll surpass. And when we're looking at just total users, 79 million users currently, it'll surpass triple digits in 2026. So in 5 years, it'll be over 100 million, and it'll reach 110 million by 2030.
That's TikTok?
That's TikTok.
Right. So, some very good detail there. I'm going to oversimplify things. Just to recap, Facebook, quite a bit over, basically 5 in 10 people in America using Facebook by 2030, 4 in 10 using Instagram by 2030, and 3 in 10 using TikTok by 2030 as it overtakes Snapchat. Any thoughts on that ranking in 2030 from anyone else?
I guess I'm just surprised that after all these years, after all that talk about, younger generation moving away from Facebook, it still remains the top even all the way through 2030. I can't really think of why. Maybe it's because it's just the first social network that everyone started with. Yeah,
the staying power is quite remarkable. I was speaking to Peter Newman, who's also on your forecasting team, who looked at social networking recently. He was showing that there is a decline. There definitely is a decline in those younger age categories. Everyone kind of college age and down to varying degrees, but it's got such a healthy middle. That kind of 22-ish to like 50-ish demographic is just kind of staying strong and just staying on Facebook. Now, will engagement slow down? Perhaps. What does the engagement look like? Will that change? What people posting less or posting more, doing different things, shopping on Facebook or whatever? Then yes, I'm sure that usage will definitely change. But then also you've got some growth in the over 65s, and actually I think the 55 to 64 as well. Some growth in the next couple of years. It kind of hits a wall eventually. So those older folks, even the growth there will slow down. But the resilience of Facebook just remarkable.
Yeah, it's more than just the social. I mean, for some people, certain demographics, social networking is Facebook, and that's all it is, and it'll continue to be the case. It just transcends real competition at this point because of its brand equity, what it stands for, and as it moves more into social commerce and its focus on communities, it's kind of breaking away its own little niche there. Or not little, huge. And so I think looking 10 years from now, I don't see how that'll change, even if it doesn't, or if it struggles to recruit younger users, because we definitely harp on that a lot, but it does not mean that there are, young, social users that are moving on to Facebook, and they still do.
Right. And I was going to say, it's also not like a linear progression. So for example, like I'm looking at my own use case too. I stopped using Facebook. I deleted it from my phone. But then since I moved, I added it back because I needed it because I moved to a new neighborhood. I wanted to join community groups, and then, right. So it's like a life stage thing too, because like, as you, for example, if you become a new mom or a new parent, you want to connect with other people who are in that same life stage, and Facebook is a great place to do that.
It's a great point. Yeah. You can get rid of Netflix. You can also pick it up again. Same with Facebook. It's a great point, Cindy.
And it benefits Instagram too, that whole ecosystem. And as they try to tie in the messaging platforms, Messenger, WhatsApp too, it just forms this ecosystem that it's harder and harder to move away from. So
right. Well, let's pause there for a second for the predictions. Time for a quick word from our sponsor VTEX. Then we'll be right back with a couple more predictions for you. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtex.com/eMarketer to learn more. Okay, we're back. We've got a couple more predictions for you for what the world's going to look like in 2030. Esports. Oscar, you looked at this one for us. Esports users, esports ads. What's the world of esports look like in 10 years?
Yeah, great. So I'd first like to explain kind of how we define it when we think of esports users. It includes its internet users who watch an organized gaming competition. And this is only hosted on digital video platforms. So we're not counting any sort of viewing on traditional or paid TV. But it involves competitions among professional players and teams. And so I just wanted to clarify that. But in terms of our predictions, where we currently are in terms of esports viewers, we say that close to 27 million Americans are currently esports viewers. What we're projecting is by 2030, there'll be 10 more million viewers. But kind of what that gets down to is that it's not growing extremely fast, like we've seen with some other activities or digital activities. So about 8% of the US population is currently an esports viewer. That'll reach 10% and then kind of not grow from there by 2030.
Yeah, by 2023, you were saying it's growing less than double digits. By 2027, 1 in 10 Americans being esports viewers. And it kind of stays there going forward. Why is that? What's capping it? What are the esports viewership hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic was a really tough year for esports. There was a lot of cancellation of in-person events. Financially, it really hit the industry pretty hard. It was felt by leagues and teams and players as well. But, when we think of what's kind of inhibiting more growth, it's also when you think of demographics, right? And it's really exploded in the last few years. But it is a bit of a niche type of, interest, if you consider it. The fact that 1 in 10 Americans is already, or nearly 1 in 10 is already kind of watching these leagues regularly is exciting, and I'm not trying to take away from that. But I do think that when you think of certain demographics, so people maybe over the age of 40, it still has to do a lot more work to involve women and get them interested in watching. So it definitely skews a little bit more towards male viewers. And, there was actually a survey from WARC recent that found that the proportion of new esports viewers in the US that had an interest or that were potentially interested in viewing was only 1%. So it does feel like maybe that ceiling is almost reached, like that cap.
That's surprising because I think of two things. One, a younger generation, which is driving this, and they're, only kind of, there's only becoming more and more younger people, which seem to be more of a gaming generation. So I thought they would have pushed this a little bit further along by then. And then number two is if you were the head of the Esports Federation for the world, and you were like, what are the perfect circumstances that, could be created where we could get people to stop watching regular traditional sports and watch esports? You'd say if we locked everyone at home and took away regular sports and made them use their computers for a year and a half. Like they seem like the perfect conditions for esports to just skyrocket. I'm really surprised it's not going to be able to.
Exactly.
In our estimation.
And that's why 2020 was a bit of a surprise in some ways, right? Because things, even though a lot of tournaments were held in person, and that's part of this, the gaming community, and that the pandemic did affect that as well. I mean, we have to also consider that it's positioning itself against sort of your live sports, right? And while there's some data in 2019, esports received almost $2 billion in investment funding. Newzoo predicted revenue was above $1.1 billion in 2020, and this is worldwide. Keep in mind, I thought of just my favorite team, FC Barcelona. They themselves surpassed the 1 billion barrier mark in revenue in 2018. That's one team in one league in one country in the world.
Yeah.
So positioning itself against a whole, behemoth of an industry is going to be tough. Yeah.
Yep. How about on the ad side of things, Oscar? Esports ad spending, I imagine that's going to be pretty capped as well.
Yeah, that will be as well. I mean, we think that it'll sort of lag, so it'll be growing a little bit faster than on the viewer side for a number of years. To give you an example, by 2023, viewer growth is at 6%. The ad spend growth is at 10%. So it'll lag, but it'll also start to flatten out. And as a percent of digital ad spending, early on, we thought maybe it would gain on digital ad spending. It was at 0.1% last year in 2020. We predict that by 2030, it'll remain with that same share at about 0.1% of digital ad spending. So a small part of it, and it'll grow kind of hand in hand with digital ad spending in general.
Okay. And what were the total dollars on that roughly? With the 0.1%, what does that mean of digital ad spending?
Yeah, the dollars, it's a little bit over. So it's 215 million in 2021.
Okay.
So it's small, as we just talked in terms of as a share of the whole market, but it'll reach to close to $340 million by 2030. So it will continue to grow.
Okay. Yeah, you make a great point about competing with sports, even, baseball, basketball, and hockey. I'm pretty sure all of those three combined, like they struggle to rival the ad revenues of the NFL. So even if you're going up against the NHL, which is the fourth most popular, or even the MLS, which seems to be coming, as according to some surveys, the fourth most popular American sport, there's a lot to compete with.
Exactly. It's more of a sport by sport thing. I mean, ESPN recently shut down its esports content division, which does not bode well,
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But it needs to maybe position itself against a specific sport, maybe a little bit further down the line. But it will continue to grow. And as you said, what it does have going for it is the Gen Z generation. But, there's other ways to view video game content. It doesn't have to be in this kind of organized, league type of format. So consider that as well.
Yep. Okay, let's move to our final prediction, telemedicine. Shelleen, you looked at this for us. Let's define it first, because telehealth, telemedicine, stuff. What are we talking about here?
So to define telemedicine, it's basically an adult who uses real-time audio, video, text, or chat to connect with their doctor to get diagnosis, treatment, or care at least once a year. So we're saying by 2030, a third of the adult population will be using telemedicine. And to give that a little bit of context, this year, less than 1 in 5 of the adult population will use telemedicine, and that will jump to 1 in 3 by 2030.
Okay. So telemedicine is I'm using like my phone or something to have an appointment with my doctor once a year. Maybe I use a tablet to have some kind of appointment. Does it have to be like a visit with a doctor? Could it be checking results, perhaps doing other activities?
Well, it has to be real time.
Results.
It has to be real time.
Oh, real time you mentioned.
Speaking to your physician or any other healthcare service provider.
Got it. Okay. So 18% using it today, once a year. Let's rewind for a few seconds because this is a relatively new number for the forecasting team, I believe. How did that number change over the last couple of years? How did the pandemic affect that number?
Yeah, so Americans have been historically, they have been very slow at adopting telemedicine due to the fear of receiving inferior quality of care. But, since the pandemic happened, the willingness to use telemedicine rose, because people were trying to avoid crowded doctor offices and, just social distance themselves at home. So, and also health insurance companies have been starting to accept telehealth bills. So that also helped to drive the adoption of telemedicine since the pandemic.
Interesting. So there was some research from Ipsos. Oscar, I think you were on the show the week you listened when I was talking about this research. We were discussing activities that Americans would rather do in person versus at home if both were safe and possible. And I was surprised to see that the activity people were most likely to return to in person was going to the doctors. 67% said I'd rather go back in person. 18% said at home is good for me. That was the number one activity people most likely to return in person for. Any thoughts, folks, from anyone else on, a third of Americans using telemedicine once a year in 10 years' time?
Yeah, Marcus, I was equally as surprised by that study. I'm not sure I buy it, I guess is the way to say it. I know people hate going to the doctor's office. Maybe they thought they would love telemedicine because they wouldn't have to go in person, and then they hated it too because they just hate doctors, period, and dentists, period, and all that. So maybe they're just never happy with medical care. I don't know what it is. I just don't buy that. I think that, it makes sense to me. I think that doctors do have to incentivize, their patients to use these services more. I feel like they could bill more hours if they fit in more people into their schedules that way. So it'll be interesting how they might do that. But I think that number is totally, attainable.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like you're replacing all of your visits with the doctors. I mean, there's some visits you need to do in person when you have your checkups, but I mean, there are some that can be replaced. Like, I mean, I know that you said that we don't count, getting results, but if it's like getting a results and having the doctor speak about them, why would I drive like an hour away or, okay, maybe not an hour, but why would I drive to a doctor?
Why are you going to the doctor's city? There's got to be someone closer.
I live pretty far outside the city now. But yeah, like why would I drive all the way just to get the results and have him speak about them? For
or like seasonal ailments too. Like when it's spring or in the winter where it's a lot of flu. And so I agree with that.
Yeah. Go on, Shelleen.
Yeah, I think COVID or some variation of COVID is something that we'll have to live with from now on. It's sort of like a new normal for us. So I think if people can avoid going to a crowded doctor office, I think they will do so. If it's, for small ailments like pink eye or something, you don't really need to go. You just need to say, hey, I've got pink eye, and then they'll prescribe something.
Prescribe you something.
Yeah, so you can save that trip.
Yeah.
Why not?
That's why that Ipsos study, I just don't
Yeah.
get it. I don't buy it.
But yes, I definitely agree. And especially as the technology allows for that real-time experience that doesn't feel like subpar care, like Shelleen is describing with pink eye or probably a chat about, hey, I wanted to see if you would recommend this type of doctor to me. Maybe I'm looking for a new dermatologist or I'm looking for a new anything. And that's something you would typically go to your primary care physician and say, hey, I would like a recommendation to this other doctor. And maybe that's something they can do over video chat or over real-time chat. So
right.
I'm sure there are instances where that's going to make sense. And I was surprised by the 1/3 number too. It just seems like a lot of sessions. But honestly, if a doctor is making time for those sessions right now in person, it's a lot less on the doctor's office, the scheduling nightmare around that whole thing. And that's how things have been transacting up until now. So I could just see it as win-win for everyone.
Yeah, Oscar, you talked about doctors pushing it more, able to fit more patients in. I guess they'd also run more on time because, one person's 5 minutes late and that has a domino effect on the rest of the day. Shelleen, are we including mental health services in this?
Yes, we do.
Okay. there are going to be different things you're going to want to see the doctor for. Maybe a telehealth visit, telemedicine visit, it does the job. Maybe you need in person. I think also there are going to be people maybe going to the doctor less and less in the future, but that in person. But maybe that doesn't mean that doesn't translate into telehealth. Similar to how people are moving away from watching live sports on traditional services. That doesn't mean they're going to end up, like I was saying, on streaming platforms. Some of them are going to consume content differently, like highlights and things. Similarly with this. Some people may be going to the doctor's office less. They may not need a telehealth visit. We could just be feeding more of our data into things like Alexa devices or smart watches. And so preventative medicine becomes a thing as we constantly, daily, weekly, put information into these wearables or just home devices, and doctors can monitor us from a distance. And so maybe we don't have to speak to them as much anyway. All right. Well, that is it for the show. Let me just recap some of those trends for you folks. We covered a lot of ground. Pay TV households. In 2030, we expect there to be 35% of households with pay TV, down from 58% today. Digital video. Top 3 will be Netflix, Prime Video, and Disney Plus. Disney Plus will overtake Hulu to take that third spot, and 70% of people will be streaming some kind of video through a paid service by 2030. Social network-wise, the top 3 will be Facebook, Instagram, and then TikTok will take the third spot away from Snapchat sometime in the next couple of years, we expect. Then esports. Esports users, just 1 in 10 Americans watching esports, and the ad spending will remain low, 0.1% of digital ad spending going to esports, as in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And finally, telemedicine. A third of people, 33% of people using telemedicine once a year by 2030, up from 18% today. So that's what's going to be going on in 2030. Maybe by 2030, we'll also have figured out the rules of lacrosse. Who knows? Who knows the rules? Does anyone know how that game is played?
Not at all.
Not
Makes
at all.
no sense. You can just run into me for no reason.
I think
It's
so.
chaos.
I learned
Chaos
about about bag toss this weekend. It was all over ESPN.
What is that?
That sounds very made. That sounds very made up.
Hold on. We watched, or we didn't watch, but I found there's like a world tag competition.
Oh
like
yeah,
actually
that is
tag?
not made up. That is real.
No, that's real. That
is
was like
crazy.
on NBC.
Yep.
And I was like, what is
Yeah, they
this?
jump through like a jungle gym type arena to try and tag someone. It's very intense for no reason whatsoever.
Like, how do you train for that?
No one knows. It's crazy. Oscar, bag toss? What are you talking about?
What's the official name of that sport?
Do you mean
cornhole?
yeah.
Cornhole.
You mean cornhole? Bag toss? What?
That's what I call it.
Okay,
Cornhole.
you were the only person on the entire planet calls it bag. Cornhole. What about cornhole? What's wrong
Just
with
that,
cornhole?
that, you were talking about lacrosse. I said I just learned all about cornhole rules, and it's
What's there to learn about
What is there
cornhole
to
rules?
learn?
What do you mean?
just that it's 3 points in the hole. It's just you subtract
Oh,
1 point
the
from
official
the other.
rules
Yeah,
of
things
cornhole.
like this. But it's exciting. Exciting
Okay.
stuff. So
So if we
lacrosse,
ever
not
play
so
cornhole
much.
with Oscar, he's like, no. We'll play official rules. Okay?
I even learned
And
how to
everyone's
toss.
like, oh, great. He's going to be a bag of laughs.
Yeah. Don't play with me. I'm good.
All right, that's all we've got time for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to my guests. I thank them in turn. Thank you to Monica.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shelleen.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Thank you guys so much. Hopefully we'll get you back in about 6 months' time to do some other predictions. There's so many other things which we could look at, VR, AR, what's going on in so many different areas, and we just covered, we covered quite a lot for now, but so many other areas we could explore for 2030 podcast. What does that world look like, etc., etc., etc. So we'll get you back in about half a year's time. Thank you so much to Victoria for editing the show. Thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. Lucas, finally.
Lucas, he came out of hiding.
He's not even home right now.
What do you mean he's not even home? He's out?
I've never heard him before.
Was he at the bank? What's going on?
He went to Manhattan. I don't know why.
What? Manhattan?
What do you mean he's in Manhattan?
By
You don't know
himself?
what.
His grandparents took him there.
Okay. You got to
He's
leave with that,
shopping.
Shelleen. You can't just be like, I think he went to Manhattan. I don't know. Ethan, where's
Without an
Lucas?
Amber
Did he go
Alert.
to Manhattan?
Amber Alert.